invite Professor Smadar Lavie, anthropologist. Her important book is The Poetics of Military Occupation. Professor Lavie serves on the board of the feminist movement Achoti, My Sister. And she will talk about Mizrahim as commodity, sign, Mizrahim as authors, cultural property rights, and relation formation with Israel and Jew.
Achoti means sister in Black English. The modern state of Israel declares itself to be the homeland of a citizenry consisting of three major groups. About 30% of Israelis are Ashkenazim, Jews originating in Central and Eastern Europe. 20% are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, and the majority of 50% is Mizrahim, Orientals in Hebrew, Jews who immigrated to Israel mainly from the Arab world. So if one is to add up the Mizrahim with the Palestinian Israelis, the majority of Israeli citizens is of Arab descent. Media charts and graphs consistently show that for every dollar an Ashkenazi male earns, a Mizrahi or Palestinian male or an Ashkenazi female usually earn about 60 cents, and that on every Mizrahi university student there are 4 Ashkenazim. Seasoned journalists are quick to note that it's way worse than the black-white income and education gap in the U.S. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has defined the categories and embodiments of traditional knowledge, which I'll refer to as TK for short, and folklore. Among these are, quote, handicrafts, works of art and performances, traces of past cultures, such as manufactured objects, images perceived as exotic, such as the appearance of indigenous people, their homes and villages, and their landscape, or cultural property, that is, culturally or spiritually significant material culture, such as important cultural artifacts that may be deemed sacred and therefore not commodifiable by the indigenous people. End quote. My talk today wishes to explore the racial formations of Israel Euro-centered IP settlers regime through the interplay between the Zionist appropriations of Arab Jewish TK and folklore and the proliferation of Ashkenazi academic careers. Critical studies on the structure and meaning of Israeli academia found out that it is mainly deployed by the Ashkenazi liberal progressive hegemony as an arm of governance over Mizrahim and Palestinians. Salvaging Mizrahi cultures, the Israeli academe regime has established a financial monopoly over the materiality of exotic Judaica discourse, not only in scholarly knowledge production, but also in the expert trade of intellectual, cultural, and real properties. When it comes to protecting Mizrahi TK and folklore, WIPO's 2002 Post-TRIPS Forum recommendations interrelating IP and TK are yet to arrive here from Oman, as is Israel's compliance with the 1886 Berne Convention or with the Hague 54 Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property or with the UNESCO 1970 Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property, when these treaties are scrutinized through the optics of collective Mizrahi IP. My talk is very preliminary, a collection of ruminations stemming out of the Yemeni Jewish scriptures and ornament affair of the 50s, its brief surface into the Israeli public sphere in the mid-80s, and the possibilities for post-TRIPS Mizrahi activism against the appropriation and commodification of Mizrahi identity in light of the current post-colonial reshapings of the notion of authorship and the repatriation of cultural properties from the Eurocenter back to communities of color. And to the affair in brief. In 1945, Yemeni Jews started fleeing en masse the poverty-stricken imam-controlled northern Yemen to the British protectorate of Aden in the south. The flight intensified after the 48th foundation of the State of Israel. Many already had relatives who fled the 20s dire economic crisis of Arabia for Palestine to become what early Zionists has designated as natural laborers, those who actually sweated for the desert to bloom. Between 46 and 51, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, or the AJDC, put them in transit camps on the outskirts of Aden. The camps were enveloped in barbed wire. Accommodating the mutual request of the AJDC and Yitzhak Ben-Tzvi, the then director of the Hebrew University Institute for the Research of Jewish Middle East Communities, the Brits erected checkpoints at the entrances into the city of Aden. Ben-Zvi's travelogue notes that the purpose of the checkpoints was to make sure that no Jew was able to escape for the prosperous Adan instead. The travelogue destines, quote, the most Arab of all Jews to be settled in the uprooted Palestinian villages, quote, to enable them immediately to resume their farm work, masonry, and other crafts they've practiced from time immemorial, end quote. It's just that they were mainly pious artisans and petty commodity traders under the leadership of rabbis who acted as both sages and scribes. Hungry and on the verge of physical collapse, after the arduous traverse of Yemen's peaks, they arrived in the camps overburdened with heavy holy scriptures, historical documents, and silver and gold Judaica jewelry they've managed to rescue from their villages and towns to preserve their traditions despite the uprootings. As they walked into the camp's merciless, harsh liminality of secularized modernity, the Ashkenazi staff stripped them of these sacred possessions and promised that these will be given back to them upon arrival to Israel. On September 30th, 49, Mr. Gluska, president of the Center of the Yemenite Organization in Israel, wrote Dr. Weinstein of the Jewish Agency that even the camp's Muslim workers were astounded to observe the manner with which the camp's staff lumped the holy scriptures into piles that were stepped on and exposed to the frying sun. Ben-Zvi, who later became Israel's second president, visited the camps to personally oversee the budding Zionization of the Yemenis and the shipment of their ancient Judaica to Israel. A letter dated December 20th, 46, sent by the luminary historian S.D. Goitein of the Hebrew University School of Oriental Studies to Y.L. Magnes, the university's president, discusses the dear and miserable Jews of Yemen who might need a helping hand to preserve their cultural treasures. To win the trust and cooperation of the camp's Jews, he recommended the use of Yosef Hubara, whom he described as a Yemeni Jerusalem school janitor and a kibbutzing lobbyist, who on his spare time volunteered his TK in silversmithy and scriptures to Goitein. In a January 1947 secret and private letter to Magnes, Goitein mentioned that he had consulted two Tel Aviv Ashkenazi dealers of Yemeni Judaica on the roundabout secretive measures required for the salvage operation. The loose freight ship, loaded with 180 tons, packed in 87 wooden boxes of holy books and scrolls and 324 boxes of personal effects, left the port of Adan for Haifa on May 10, 1950. Other ships with similar freight arrived in Eilat and Jaffa. On June 28, 1950, Goitein wrote a thank you note to the AJDC for their financial support of his Yemeni research, CC'd to the director of Israel's National Library. He recommended his Tel Aviv Yemeni assistant to help sort out the freight. Along the years, repeated requests of Yemeni owners of the scriptures and ornament to have them returned were all in vain. Rather, the items were locked in archives and museum basements, accessible only to scholars holding postgraduate degrees, or sold to antique Judaica dealers who in turn sold them to Ivy League universities, museums, and private Judaica collectors. A proliferation of financial and academic assets ensued. The community leaders who kept insisting on the repatriation of their cultural possessions were either co-opted into middle-class government jobs or framed for political corruption. Only in recent years is the general public able to enjoy some access to the Israeli archives. Yemeni activists assume that the recent leniency has to do with the expiration of the statute of limitation over a possible lawsuit in view of no past litigation. One might only assume that the Ashkenazi hegemony treated the TK and folklore of other Arab Jewish ethnic groups in a similar manner. Stripping Mizrahim of their cultural properties made it easier for the Zionist establishment to muffle any resistance to its civilizing mission. These days, as Mizrahim are hit the hardest by Israel's neoliberalism, and like Palestinians, we've got no originary alternative discourse of materiality to resort to. Like the case of First Nations, Mizrahi identity has been defined and determined by a bureaucracy committed to its disappearance. We thus search for oppositional identities. It's a battle of representational materialities between the tactical essentialism of subalterns and the fantasy escapism of the enlightened intellectual hegemony. My argument here is threefold. First, I argue that since its European inception in Palestine, the Ashkenazi IP regime transformed Mizrahim into what Rosemary Coombe calls commodity signs, and I'm quoting, signs that are commodities with an exchange value in their own rights, as well as signifiers with a field of cultural connotations, and those who consume them animate the legal regulations of cultural form, end quote. Unlike Coombe, however, I argue that consuming Mizrahim as commodity signs, the Zionist IP regime actually blocked any animation of the legal regulation of Mizrahi cultural forms. It did so to erase all traces of its intra-Jewish racism. In so doing, it was able to rely on the Mizrahi demographic majority to silently move the cogs of its cultural economic project of Israel's de-Arabization. Nevertheless, the Mizrahim, transformed into commodified cultural forms, simultaneously became the mediums that facilitated Ashkenazi expressions of alterity. Secondly, I wish to argue that Zionism was able to exploit Mizrahim as commodity signs due to its erection of the modernist romantic boundaries, artificially forcing a separation between intellectual property, cultural property, and real property. In my earlier work on authorship and appropriation, I argued that Israel has blocked the possibility of de-romanticized indigenous criticism. Utilizing the romantic notion of authorship, the Ashkenazi dealer scholar was able to short-circuit any resistance to his TK plunder through the economic pillaging of Mizrahi communities, which in turn prevented many Mizrahim from entering into the privileged sphere of the academe regime. Those who did manage to get in and conduct some form of cultural inquiry were allowed to do so only through the parroting of the Zionist narrative that bestows modernity over Arab primitivities, whether Jewish or not. Overlooking issues of TK and folklore, Gatton trips have paradoxically led to the proliferation of subaltern NGOs whose goal is to speak for the Gattons and trip silences. In Israel, however, the globalization and privatization of the economy are interconnected to the upper class's so-called peace dividend on the one hand. On the other, they brought about the emergence of Mizrahi NGOs fighting for equal opportunities and social justice. These NGOs focus on employment, education, housing, and land rights as they overlook the situatedness of their agenda in the IP regimes of late capitalism. Working from within the imbricated agential webs of Zionism, with or without the post-suffix, Mizrahi activists are yet to be able to act as a cohesive group to legally or illegally reclaim the insignia of their pre-Israeli Arab Jewish alterities and end the continuing commodification of either their Mizrahi names, images, and motifs, or their histories and anthropologies. A commodification enacted whether in the mass market or in the career industry of the academe regime. And last but not least is the ethnographer's positioning in studying the post-industrial critique of subaltern IP histories. How unsurprising to find myself on a podium of an Israeli university speaking about Yemenis. Isn't this the eternal return of the imagined authentic narrative of origins I, a half Yemenite, am expected to perform for you? How fortunate I am that the California taxpayer picked up the bill that enabled me to join the Mizrahi and Palestinian political exiles, lucky to escape Israel's sophisticated academic apartheid choke chain. Presently, back home, due to familial trauma, I'm nothing but the proverbial Mizrahi woman, a single welfare big mama, too senior and old of a bitch to be trained back into Israeli anthropology. That magical terrain which permits one to research anything as long as one is an Ashkenazi, loyal to the principle that Mizrahim and Palestinians exist as texts to be salvaged, appropriated, and become a manual for governmentality. All the while, for the academe regime, the contemporaneous vagaries of our racinated lived realities are also transparent. Lavie, the daughter of Indian immigrants to California, claims that those loss or absence of a cultural heritage, sometimes called acculturation, is deeply felt by second generation around the world. It necessitates a research into what she terms a field of failure. For Visvasvaran, A feminist anthropologist's field of failure is the societal zone of hope, because a racinated feminist ethnography points up the difficulties in our own epistemological assumption and representational strategies, questions the authority of the investigating subject without paralyzing her, persistently transforms conditions of impossibility into possibility. Let me concur and further argue that any form of Mizrahi or Palestinian anthropology in Israel but the Ashkenazi Zionist salvage of decay and folklore is impossible, since it doesn't bear the potential of becoming a field of failure. The current indigenous move away from the simplistic reduction of native concerns to trademarks or copyright, however, moves us away from the imposition of colonial juridical categories on post-colonial struggles. I hope that such a move further liberates the Mizrahi struggle so that it can redeem the collective cultural authorship of our Arab Jewish parents and grandparents and repatriates our cultural properties in order to create a zone of hope for Israel and Palestine in the midst of the Arab world.